Faith Mangope, and it is an absolute honor and a privilege to be with you once again, giving you these high-level conversations, which really will really shift the way that we think, the way that we do business, the way that we even think about thinking sometimes, which is often needed. We bring you different perspectives from our global leaders, some who've moderated conversations, others who have been at the forefront of championing change, especially from a business and a trailblazing perspective. These are all individuals that gather together once a month and help us shift the way that we impact and the way that we think about the way that we're doing business. And of course, this afternoon is no different from any other one. This is a 45 high impact, high level conversation with yet another incredible individual. So when I say that you're in for quite a treat, I do mean that you are in for quite a treat. As always with our leadership series, please do keep the conversation as engaging as possible. There will be a chat box for you to actually ask your questions, send through your comments. We want to hear from you this afternoon. And please, let's keep it as interactive as possible. You know how we feel when it comes to questions. There is no question that is either too insignificant to ask, because every single question that you may have or even comment is definitely important. And speaking about incredible individuals, I'm going to go straight into the conversation because, as always, we bring you the best of the best here at the Stellenbosch Business Institute. And we've done so as well, particularly this afternoon. Let me tell you about our guests, from the grace and poise of Her Excellency Graça Marcel to the intentionally and power embodied by Melinda Gates. We've got Nozipho Tshabalala, who's a conversation strategist, having engaged with world leaders and luminaries, guiding conversations that challenge the norms and push boundaries. She's joining us today. If you don't know about Nozipho Tshabalala, trust you, by the end of today, not only are you going to be knowing her, you're also going to be Googling and searching for her expertise, because she really is known as a go-to moderator for presidential and high-level panel conversations globally. She's moderated conversations for global bodies, including the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the International Labour Organization, the United Nations, the African Union, governments, as well as multinationals from across this wonderful globe of ours. And it particularly pays a certain mind to the theme of the conversation that we're going to have today, which is around enhancing and perhaps looking at how do we advance our growth mindset? How do we grow this growth mindset? And how do we enhance the growth mindset? And for some of us who've never really come to terms with what do we mean by growth mindset, do stick around, because this conversation speaks exactly to some of these themes. And speaking about which, I'm going to pause it here and I'm going to welcome the lady herself in this conversation. Nozipho, thank you so much for availing yourself on such a busy day, one can imagine. But welcome to the Stellenbosch Business Institute LeaderSHIFT series.
Thank you so much, Faith. It's such a privilege and such an honor to have been invited. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Well, from being a presidential moderator and a conversation strategist, I always say that there's a person behind the profile. Let's talk a little bit about the person behind that profile. Who is Nozipho? Maybe let's go into home life, your background, and some of the insights that we may not necessarily know about you.
So everybody who's been within earshot will know that I'm from Pietermaritzburg, because I've appointed myself as ambassador of my home city. I come from KZN. But I've actually lived more of my life here in Gauteng. I've also had an opportunity to live and study in the UK and in the US. So on and off, but predominantly based here in Gauteng and in Johannesburg. I come from a family of 5. So I've got 3 sisters and a brother. And very small family. My parents were absolutely phenomenal, best friends. So that's had a huge influence on me. And I consider myself as a global citizen. My work takes me all over the world, but I think more than that, I think it's the mindset when you're in the world as well. So a global citizen, an African by choice, an ambassador for Africa in everything that I do. But certainly, small town girl doing some interesting things in the big wide world.
And speaking about doing the interesting things, it's not only just about doing the interesting things, but meeting the interesting people. And I think when you honed in about how, some of the conversations that you're having are at that high level, that presidential level, it brings one to really the beginning of our conversation regarding, the impact of having a growth mindset in influencing decision-making, especially at that high level. I mean, here you've moderated conversations with presidents and world leaders, but there is a thread amongst them, which is how do they enhance and how they harness their growth mindset. Maybe let's start from the beginning in terms of what exactly, and how would you define a growth mindset? And how do you see that growth mindset having influenced some of the leaders that you have had the privilege of working closely with?
Thanks, Faith. I think it's a really great place to start. And if I were to consolidate and extrapolate my experiences of having really engaged not only with presidents, but with executives as well, who are running organizations across the continent and the world, within the academic space and civil society, there are some commonalities with people who do have, or leaders that have, a growth mindset. The first one, which I think really gives us that definitive character, is that they see challenges as opportunities. They look at a challenge and they go, well, that's an opportunity to do something that we have not yet figured out. Whether that is we haven't figured it out from a policy perspective, or we haven't figured it out from a corporate strategy perspective, but the challenge in itself is framed as an opportunity, and then they galvanize their energy towards that challenge. They also are people who have a deep learning culture, not only just within themselves, but the spaces in which they lead are characteristic of having a deep learning culture. And that can look a couple of ways. It can look at like an organization that is very intentional about mentorship and coaching. It could look like an organization that's very intentional about intergenerational conversations, and thereby almost creating that a flow of information and feedback and learning from a generational perspective. But they themselves are very curious people. They themselves always want to learn about which that they don't know. They run towards the gray, if that makes sense. They run towards the dark because they know that that's where the gift of something new lies. And they're able to translate that into their organizations, structurally through formal coaching, mentorship programs, but informally in terms of how the culture comes to life as well. I think another one is these leaders would see failure as part of the process. And I'll give you an example. I was really fortunate to be moderating a conversation about venture capitalists and the extent to which they are now really putting money behind women-led startups. And one of the leaders on the panel expressed this idea that, what we are seeing increasingly is that even as venture capitalists and other investors are thinking about who do they invest in, they're making provision for the fact that somewhere down the line, maybe more than once, maybe more than twice, that idea is actually going to fail. And so they are baking in failure as part of the learning process. And so this idea that we put money between born big ideas that have already made it, that are fail safe, is actually something that doesn't exist in the lexicon and the language of leaders with a growth mindset. And let me just do two more. And this one's quite important for me. And I'll give you an example of a leader who's like this. The CEO of the Mercedes-Benz F1 team, Toto Wolff, talks about this a lot. And he talks about leaders that are able to create space for debate and engagement. So actually to encourage engagement. So when people put ideas on the table, to crowd other people's voices in and say, let's go at it with a hammer, so that we can see what the lessons we might learn in the weakness of what we've put together. And I think that's really important, because a lot of leaders typically want to step into a space with an idea that is irrefutable, that cannot be challenged, because it's oftentimes the leader's idea and that you've come up with a solution. And leaders with a growth mindset say, if we are able to create an environment where we can debate and engage around ideas, what we come out with on the other end is an even better idea or better solution, because of all the eyeballs and the fingerprints that have been able to look and touch the thing that we're working on. And as a conversation strategist, the ability to hold space for debate is actually incredibly inspirational for me. And when I see it, I think it's absolutely fantastic. And it leads me to my last point, which is leaders with a growth mindset model that growth mindset. They encourage people to challenge them publicly. And I'll use an example again here. There's an amazing book. I've not had the privilege of interviewing this leader, but I've had the privilege of interviewing the author who wrote this book. There's a book called No Rules Rules. And that's the story of how Netflix was born and how Netflix came about. And it's a story about Reed Hastings, who's one of the co-founders. And in that story, they talk about this thing that Reed used to do with Patty McCord. Patty McCord was the group HR head. And Patty came to him and said, Reed, people don't like challenging you in public because you're the boss and they're so worried about what you're going to say. And he said, well, I think the only way we do that is if you challenge me publicly so that people can see that I'm okay with being challenged and I want to learn from those challenges. So Patty took it seriously. And so the next day they went into an executive meeting and she was like, Reed, sorry, that idea. And eventually people looked at this dynamic and went, oh, this really is a safe space. We can actually challenge, and through challenging, we can see how their conversation is leading them to a better outcome. So it's important not to just talk growth mindset as a leader, but to be an exemplary definition and a reflection of what a growth mindset is. So I hope it's a long, long way of answering what I think is a brilliant question, because it allows us to all just sort of come into the same frame of what a growth mindset is and what it is not.
Yeah. As you're speaking about, certain elements, and we're going to be unpacking it together as you've defined a growth mindset and elaborated with some of these examples. We'll deal with failure in just a moment, because I think it deserves its own piece of attention. But you said something also regarding people that are able to learn. And learning means getting or perhaps amending the hardwiring. How then do you start speaking to leaders who say, Noz, don't fix it if it's not broke? Because that growth mindset, because a lot of businesses are traditional businesses, they are legacy businesses. My great grandfather did it this way, my grandfather did it this way, I'm doing it this way. So far, the bottom line is proving that profit is being made. We don't need to change the strategy because it has been working for generations. And sometimes you've got leaders like this, even leaders in countries who believe this leader did it this way. Don't rattle, don't move the waters, just continue on the same trajectory so that you can get the same results. How then do you speak to individuals who are saying, but do I really want to fix it if it's not broke?
Well, I think if the leader is the one saying, let's not fix it because it's not broke, I think we're probably in dangerous territory already. The enemy of great is good. And I just think it's something that as leaders we've got to constantly think about, is that once you become fluent in something and you're just really good at it, potentially the invitation for you as a leader is to think about, what does this look like in a great context? And again, I'll throw out another book, and thank you for those who are picking up the books. This is an old book, but I just feel like it's really changed my life in terms of really thinking about how do I constantly move from good to great in everything that I do. And so the book is called Good to Great by Jim Collins. And I think it's really important, if the leader is the one who's already thinking, let's not move, to probably think that those who are holding the leader accountable need to be having the growth mindset with him or her, that, being the board or being other executives. What I think typically happens, or what I hope would happen, is that you have a leader or a leadership that is ready to go. But within that cohort of people that need to come with are oftentimes resistors. And the people who show resistance, I typically find that resistance is important to understand from its source. What is the source and the cause of that resistance? And human nature is such that we fear the unknown. We don't want to run towards things that we do not understand. So typically, there's a fear of unknown. So you want to go from good to great. Yeah, but what does great really look like? What does great really mean for me? The second one is a fear of a loss of control. When we're really good at something, it's because we can do it with our eyes closed. It comes so naturally. And we have a huge degree of control, not only over our skill that we're bringing to bear in that moment, but oftentimes even over the environment if we're the one who's leading. And so we've got to address, is there a perception that this could lead to a loss of control? And how do we begin to engage with that? There's also recency bias, right? And recency bias says, it's good here. And so it's a bias towards a favorable attitude to that which we have just recently experienced. And so if our results are great, we're not going to go out and poke the bear because we're in search of innovation and we're in search of something new, because that poking the bear might actually, come up and work against us. So we've got to be constantly checking ourselves as leaders to say, is my inertia informed by a recency bias? And why am I fearful about, really engaging with what could be next? And of course, when people resist, it's also because of past negative experiences. And what I mean by that is that you've tried something in the past, the change management process around it could have been horrible, or they saw the impact of it on others. There was a restructure, people lost jobs. And so the minute you sort of suggest that there's something that we're going to do that is different to the norm, you get that very anxiety-filled reaction. So what do you do? If this is the reality, we are scared of that which we don't know. We don't like not being in control. We are all prone to recency bias. We usually have traumatic responses to past negative experiences. How does a leader who has a growth mindset, who's seeing what's next, how does he or she get their people to move with them? And I think the simple answer is, firstly, make the unknown known. And I oftentimes, this is where we miss the boat a lot. The assumption that everybody understands. Of course, we've got to move. Of course, we've got to partner with that organization. Of course, we've got to go into that product market. Of course, that's the next revenue stream. And just eliminate the of course in your lexicon. Eliminate it's obvious. Nothing's obvious. And you kind of have to do the work as a leader of over communicating, overselling the why, over explaining the why. And as you do that, just remember, there's only one question that people is sitting at the top of their list of many questions. And that's, what's in it for me? So in your talk, you kind of needs to get to the nuts and bolts of what is everybody needing this change to mean for them? And to what extent are you able to communicate that? And that is why sometimes as a leader, as you live into your growth mindset, you've got to be thinking about, do you have multiple separate conversations before you bring everybody into one conversation? Because what's in it for me is not going to be the same for everybody in the conversation. Another often overlooked, really simple tool to get people to move with you is training and skills. Because remember, when you feel the loss of control is oftentimes because you don't think you either have the capability to do what is going to be required in the next. It's the real reason, it's one of the reasons at least, why we have such a resistance to understanding. Initially it was automation, now it's AI, and the easier thing to do is just to say, it's a scary boogeyman and it's going to take all our jobs. And that's because we're not saying to people, in this new world that we are journeying towards, what will be required of you is this, and this is what we're putting in your hands so that you are in control of your destiny and your journey, even as you go along. So training cannot be overlooked. And when I say training, I'm not saying let's dish out Harvard MBAs at R1 million a pop to everyone. Sometimes it's a full day training. Sometimes it's a half day, just to give people a sense of control back into whatever it is that you're trying to move them towards to. And then the last one is, I think we say this because it's, you hear it everywhere, and I just don't think we do it enough. And that is celebrating small wins. And what I mean by this is that when we want to move people, for them to see a challenge as an opportunity, to want to grow towards a particular destination, we've often focused on the finish line. And so even as we're selling the vision of the land of milk and honey. People don't, the land of milk and honey is great, it's going to happen over there. But what about what's happening right now? And so to be able to look at the journey in totality as a learning journey in itself is important as a leader with a growth mindset. And to not only celebrate what people have produced, but to celebrate how people have behaved. And so, for example, to build in systems and processes that allow us to catch people behaving well. And to be able to celebrate that and say, well, that's what growth looks like. That's what reframing a challenge into an opportunity looks like. That's how holding a space for positive debate actually looks like. And actually, we want to celebrate that behavior. We reinforce behaviors by celebrating them over and over again when we see them. So I'll pause there for now. But I really hope that, you know, it gives us a little bit more practical, you know, sort of tools in our hands to think about, in the face of resistance, what are some of the things we can do to help us to move people? Because a growth mindset in a static environment is exactly how people's dreams go to die. And so if the leader you know, isn't able to live out that growth mindset, that leader leaves. And if people have a growth mindset, but the leader is suffering from recency bias, those people leave.
It certainly is definitely a balancing act that I believe many leaders are experiencing, especially in their organizations. And we often make reference to that, is that people went into self-preservation mode during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we really learned how to preserve. And when you preserve, you do not necessarily look outward, because the little that you've got, you want to maintain the status quo, so as it were. And now post-COVID, we're looking at how then do we start practically implementing those tools that allow us to grow in spaces. And I love what you were saying, that the enemy of great is good, you know, and how do we get out of that good so that we can reach into the great? I love that. I'm going to write that down. It's beautiful. The enemy of good, of great is good. Nozipho, then let's talk a little bit about fear of failure, and those that have experienced failure, because a lot of times we find that growth in itself is often prohibited by people's experience and encounter with failure. And I often say, if you're looking at, for example, South Africa's economy, where we're seeing to be growing by between 1.2 to 1.5% GDP, or we're even experiencing 0.4% GDP growth, we're seeing that we're not growing. So talking about a growth mindset, South Africa needs a shot of a growth mindset on its own. And sometimes that could often span into what failure looks like. And a lot of leaders would be struggling to recover from failure, or to learn and process and progress from failure. Talk to us a little bit about how then do we start communicating failure to those who are employees in these organizations, and perhaps also to the leaders of organizations. How then do we start managing failure? Because managing failure is it's hard. It's facing the demons that you want to run away from.
So I'm going to ask for your permission for me to first share a very personal story to try and illuminate, you know, that the journey of having to deal with failure in my own life, and then how I now think about it in the corporate environment, especially even as I run my own business. And I share the story because I think sometimes we don't make the connection with how significantly deep failure can sometimes sit, even to our very core. I don't want to say DNA, because DNA makes you feel like it's unravelable. That's not an English word, but I've just made it up. Because failure can be so deep and entrenched in the experiences that we've had. So I grew up in a very, very poor environment. My mother was a street vendor. My father was a factory worker and later a security guard. And because of that, I grew up with the understanding that every opportunity that comes my way, I have absolutely just one shot to convert it. I don't have the privilege of failing fast and failing forward, as we say these days, right? I've got to make that one opportunity work. And so when I got the opportunity to go to university, I didn't have this idea that, oh, I could come into first year and go, let me do a BCom, and maybe if I don't like it, I can then transition. It was, okay, what is the cheapest thing on the prospectus? What's the thing that's fail-safe that's going to get me in? And how do I get in and pass the first time round and pass all my modules and get as much of that converted in, of that NSFAS loan converted into a bursary as possible? And that was a mindset that I grew up with. This is one shot. I've only got one shot at this, and I cannot fail at all. And it was so deep because it was survivalist. It was the difference between me becoming like everybody else that I saw in my community, or having one shot to have a life that is different, but more importantly, a life that would get my family out of poverty, a life that would allow me to educate my siblings, provide for my family. So it was very, very deep. And then I get into the world of work and everybody is singing, fail fast, fail forward. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I don't want even to fail at all. What are you talking about? I don't want to fail forward, sideways anyway. Just let me get it right the first time and, let's get on with it. And I really had to do the work of realizing that what served me up until that point was now a disservice, not only to my career, but a disservice to my relationships and a disservice to who I want to be as a person. And so I needed to do the work of letting go. And this leads me then to, so how do we help to manage failure so that failure doesn't seem as if it's this big thing in our organizations, and in fact, it's seen as part of the process of learning and growing. The first thing as a leader is to remember that it doesn't matter what you say. What matters is what you do. And what I mean by this is that we oftentimes say, no, guys, fail fast, fail forward. We're learning, and then the person fails. And your reaction is not consistent with the fail fast, fail forward guy. And so we need to be congruent as leaders. And so the first reaction to failure is important because that sets the tone of whether failure is permissible within your organization or not. That sets the tone for whether there is a psychologically safe space to fail in your organization or not. You can have it on posters, you can have it as part of your values, you can have it anyway. But if you as a leader don't behave consistently and congruently to that, then people will not see failure as part of the process. The second thing is, and I love this, I've seen this in a number of organizations, is win-loss reviews, right? So this idea is you go out, maybe you pitch for a piece of work, and what typically happens in organizations is that if you get the piece of work, nobody's now calling a meeting to say, okay, guys, let's talk about what we did well to get that piece of work. It's like, hey, hooray, we're gone. We got the piece of work, we left. And if you didn't get the piece of work, nobody's sitting us down to say, let's unpack the lessons. The language becomes who's to blame. So win-loss reviews are not about who is responsible for us either winning, because when you begin to highlight only the winners in the process anyway, you're creating these superheroes within the organizations. And it's also not about leveling blame on who's responsible for us not getting the piece of work. A win-loss review needs to happen when you win or when you lose. When you win, to unpack and pause, what did we do well or differently in this regard? And how do we replicate that? What is the lesson that we take from that? And how can we apply that in another context? In the same sentence, that if it's a loss, what is the lesson for us out of this? What do we take from this loss that becomes an asset for us as we go into the next into the next space? I always say, somebody asked me the question and said, oh, as a conversation strategist, do you hope that your children might be able to be really fluent in conversations as well? And it's like, oh, well, actually, I don't have an answer for that. What I do hope is that they feel confident enough that whatever it is they have to say, doesn't matter if it's wrong or it's right. Either way, it's going to add value, because even the wrong things help us to refine so that we're able to get to the next best thing. So win-loss reviews, what you say is not as important as what you do. And let's take seriously wherein lies the fear of failure within the people that work for us. We take it too superficially, I think, and we don't realize how deeply in our bones we're carrying that.
Well, Nozipho, we've got lots of questions and lots of comments, and thank you to everybody that is sending their messages via the chat box. We really do appreciate it. I'm going to start off with Karen Bowdenhorst, who says that how do people behave well? That is a question. It is all about practical communication skills, emotional intelligence, and leaders hashtag leaders effectiveness training. That's the question around how do people actually behave well. Nico Olivier is saying, adding to the above, question, and I believe that is the question to Karen, saying, do you have practical ways on how to reward or measure good behavior? I agree that that will set us up for success in the longer term, although the shortest term journey may be tough. So that's again about behavior. I'm going to give you another one, Nozipho, because I see that you are jotting down. Shoaib saying, difficult to have a growth mindset in the face of rampant crime, corruption, crypto success, where 23-year-olds have made more money in a short space of time when hard work doesn't seem to get rewarded. Oh, Shoaib, you're even talking about the TikTokers and the YouTubers, and never mind the crypto guys as well, who've managed to make crypto success, but people that have literally come up overnight and they have become overnight successes and multimillionaires at the age of 23, which is very true in the world, in the dynamic world that we're living in. So we've got a few on around behavior, good behavior, and practical ways on how to reward or measure this good behavior. And of course, with the difficult to have a growth mindset in the face of rampant crime, corruption, crypto success, and the 23-year-old multimillionaire.
Sure, there's a lot going on there, but let me start off with Karen, and if I think that's the question on you know, what does how do
people behave well? That was Karen, and saying that it's about practical communication skills and emotional intelligence.
And I agree with you. I agree with you, Karen, that, you know, it is about emotional intelligence. The thing about growth mindset is that it's not easy. It's not easy to run towards feedback. And then one of the critical ingredients about a growth mindset is that I mean, we say this all the time, but it's saying it and doing it is very different, is to actually run towards feedback. And not actually worry whether the feedback is good or bad. And in fact, mine the negative feedback, because that's wherein lies your opportunity to do better. I'm going to throw in another book. The author is Ryan Holiday. And the book, I believe, is called The Obstacle is the Way. I'm looking at my bookshelf and I can't see it because it's usually eye line level there. The obstacle is the way. And what Ryan Holiday says is that in order for us to get to our next best or any breakthrough moment, you can't actually break through anything if you don't struggle through it. And this is why we started off with great being the enemy of, good being the enemy of great, because people with a growth mindset must love struggle. And this is why I actually agree with Shoaib to a certain extent, is that hard work has gotten a bad rep. We all just want things that happen overnight. But when we struggle, what we're actually doing is we're building new neural pathways. We're building new muscle. We're trying to figure out, why does this not work? And I'll give you an example. I've got an 18-month-old son. He's got this little round thing with shapes, and he has to take a piece of the shape. He has to match it in. If it's a star, it's a star. It's a triangle, it's a triangle. And I watched my nanny this side of the time he had taken the star and he was trying to, squash it through the square. And she was like, oh, no, don't do that. And she showed him the square. And I said to her, no, don't show him, because he needs to build a neural pathway that allows him to learn to struggle through not getting the star in the square, for him to kind of understand that the star got to go with the star and the square's got to go with the square. And so growth mindset is a beautiful model, but it's really hard to implement. To look at a challenge and see an opportunity takes a certain kind of individual who is already able to firstly admit that that's hard, that's a challenge. And then it's not this like airy-fairy thing, like every time something goes wrong, you're going to go, opportunity, let's run towards it. It's a very real reaction to say, I actually don't know what I'm doing right now. I've been pushing, and I'm not getting the results. I'm actually struggling. And then to go, where can I get help? Who can I pull in? Who can I learn from? So that's what, and I wouldn't want to use good behavior, but that's the behavior that's required in order for you to really build a growth mindset. Nico, I love your question about, so how do we practically reward good behavior? So there's an organization that I sit on the board of, and I'm not going to mention it. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention organizations. Julia will decide in the chat. But one of the things that they have is an internal a system. It's like an intranet. I think that's what you call it. The intranet allows you to celebrate people. They actually call it celebrates. So Faith is not aware that I've been watching her in a meeting and she did something, for example, where, we went in for a win-loss review and we'd done really badly. And she was the one who was extrapolating the lessons for us. I then go into the portal and I celebrate Faith in front of in front of everyone in the organization on this portal to say, Faith, in this moment, this is what I saw you do. I want to celebrate you. And the beauty of it is that they then align it with what value within the organization is that aligned to. So to your question, celebrate publicly, celebrate systematically. If you do have a system and a platform, use it not only just to give people information, but use it for people to celebrate each other. Use the values as the pillars to say there are certain behaviors under each value that we're looking for in the organization. And when you see people behaving in that way, this is when we celebrate it. So it allows the values to be a living expression of the culture within the organization. So it's doable. It can be done. And I think it works magic because the values become alive and they're not sitting on some frame somewhere. And then to Shaib's question, it's a big sigh for me because unfortunately, we do live in a world where we're not only consuming things in like nanoseconds, but our expectations of what is possible has also just completely been turned on its head. And so I can't take away from your observation that, hard work certainly seems to have gotten a bad rep. But where I do think that acknowledgement can still be given is to the people who are constantly just innovative, even within those spaces. So if I think about, I'm on TikTok. I don't have an active account, but I like before the end of my day to amuse myself with whatever people are posting about in those moments. And I'm absolutely blown away at just how much innovation is happening on TikTok, and people have been given a platform to showcase how they're doing things differently. So I think the difference is now we're just consuming these things so much more readily. But I think there's a lot of innovation, a lot of doing things differently and showcasing that they can be done. I'll give you one example too before I go off on this. In, I don't know what month this is now. This is September. In July of this year, in Kenya, young people literally took to the streets and rioted. They used TikTok as their main mode of actually connecting, and WhatsApp and even Instagram. And the reason why they were rioting was that the new administration was about to pass a bill, a finance bill, that was going to literally take the taxes of ordinary households through the roof for basic foodstuffs like bread. Was going to be like 3-4 times the amount of tax that was on it. And you quickly see how innovative people are in the sense of using whatever's available for them to create pathways to better. The long and short of it is the government, at the end of the day, realized they can't sign that bill into law. They had to retract. There were firing of a couple of ministers as well. And I'm raising this to say, don't lose hope. There are still people who are doing great. And Faith, it would be so amiss for me to not use this last example. Not outside of the country, in South Africa. And I know, guys, just bear with me on this. I had to go and update my driver's license. I'm in Johannesburg. I went to the waterfall. There's a new, what do you call it? Traffic department at Waterfall. And this is South Africa. This is last month. I was in and out in 10 minutes. And when I went to go pick it up, I was in there for all of 90 seconds and I was out. So what I'm saying is that in areas, if we unpack what's happening in pockets of excellence in the country, I can bet my last 50 cents that in those areas are leaders with a growth mindset, leaders who are looking at a challenge and saying, this is not how the country needs to be, and we can change this. We're failing at this, and there's a way to do better. We can learn from each other, we can debate, and we don't have to follow the flock and follow the norm. So it's a little bit of a soapbox, but I hope that there's something in there for you, Shuaib.
I like the part that you were sharing, that even in pockets of excellence in society, you'll often find that then the pockets of excellence, there are people with a growth mindset, that those pockets of excellence are not just happening. It is driven behind somebody who actually wants to see a better cause and move from that good to great. I'm just looking at the time, 3 minutes left. Who would have thought? Time really does go fast when it comes to these leadership series. But Nozipho, maybe you can just help us take it home and drive the message, because I do see some of these some of the messages are still coming in and the conversations are still happening, which I really do appreciate. Please do keep sending them on the chat box as well, as we try to as we close this conversation in just a moment with Nozipho. But I'm going to read from TMCB saying that despite the pursuits of flawless leadership, people sometimes fail. With that said, the trouble is that leadership failures can sometimes damage credibility. And how does one regain credibility if they lost it? I love this question from Team CB. Regaining credibility after you've lost it as a result of failure. And perhaps whilst integrating this particular comment and question from Team CB, perhaps we can also look at then driving home those practical steps of how do we start. If I say, Nozipho, I want to start today, I want to develop this mindset that you're speaking about today, where would I begin and how do I begin?
Okay, fantastic. I think those are two great questions. I do want to give a shout out to Zandile Kota, who says she is at our TMC. That's the place where I did the license, and she's recruited everyone there. Zandile, well done. You guys are a shining light, and I am your self-appointed ambassador. I tell everybody in my WhatsApp groups about you guys as much as I can. So a very big well done, and you are certainly a shining light in the country. So the first one to as a leadership failure that's led to a loss of credibility, how do I get it back? First step is ownership. When we failed, we've got to own that failure, especially when it's been a public failure. You know, sometimes we fail publicly, but we want to own the failure privately. That's not going to work. Because you know how you're processing it, but nobody else knows that. So owning that failure is very, very important, to say, this is what I set out to do. And this is, my intention might have been this, but the outcome doesn't match the intention. And I want to take ownership over that. And after ownership comes accountability. And the beautiful thing about accountability is that it's baked in action. You hold yourself accountable to a certain corrective action. So now that I'm owning that this is what I've done and this is how I failed, what am I going to do about it? I like to think about this as the so what and the now what. So what is, this is what's happened. Now what is, what am I actually going to do about it, right? And so accountability and saying, these are the actions as a leader. Could be one action, could be 2, 3, but the fewer the better. Because once you also start reeling off 20 things that we're going to do, believability comes down. And a huge part of getting back credibility is believability in your ownership and in your accountability. And then the last thing is that you then need to act. And I think the power of that is that people are open to regaining the trust of a person who's doing the work of getting that trust back. So Mr. MCB or Ms. MCB, Team CB, I hope that that's helpful. Ownership, accountability, followed by action. I think that's the way you build back credibility. And then to the final question of where do we start? I think it's a brilliant question. The first one is have an honest conversation with yourself about what are you challenged about right now? What are you struggling with? Where are you failing to make breakthrough? Because once you name a thing and you give it its space, you then have a directed pathway. You have a target to which to work towards. Then in terms of the learning that's important for growth mindset, to say, what might I need to learn in order for me to, do I need help from someone? Do I need to call someone? Do I need coaching? Do I need mentorship? Do I need a degree? Do I need a certificate? Is it an online course? Is it a YouTube video that I need to consume in order to learn the skill and the capability to get me to the next? And then I think you make failure part of the process. So ask yourself, and if I fail, then what? And that's, you kind of bake in grace into your process and expect that you're going to struggle. And again, in that Ryan Holiday book, he talks about going back and doing things differently, experimentally, failing and failing again until the breakthrough comes. So expect to struggle, expect things to be hard, and expect that the breakthrough is not going to come at first try. And then the last thing is feedback. As I'm trying, how open am I going to be to the feedback, especially because I'm not there yet, I'm still working on it. The feedback might not be great. And have I made peace with the fact that I'm going to get negative feedback until I get to a place of where I'm good at what I'm trying to do? And when I'm there, how do I start the process again in order to get to great?
Nozipho, I wish I had all day with you, but of course we have come to the end of this conversation. But thank you so much for joining us this afternoon with our leadership series. What an absolutely insightful conversation we had around how do we start developing, and practically so, how do we start developing this growth mindset, and how do we face the fear of failure and overcome the fear of failure. And I love the last part around credibility, gaining back credibility once you have failed, especially once you have failed in public. Thank you once again to everybody who have joined us and who has taken the time out of their busy schedule to join us this afternoon. What an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be in your company. Do remember, it happens once a month, so we'll see you again in the month of October. Do not fret, of course, because a recording of today's conversation will also be available on the SBI website. So please go on and click ahead and check that out. The link will also be sent to you. Have a fantastic rest of your Wednesday until we shift again. For myself as well as Nozipho and the SBI team, have a wonderful day. Goodbye.